Hello and welcome everybody, I'm ProperVarian and this is Victoria 3's 18th Dev Diary, and we are out of the woodworks. We are out of everything related to economy and politics. Today we talk about the first Dev Diary that is, externally oriented, meaning diplomacy, meaning maybe wars, meaning anything that is between countries rather than within one country. And this one will be about rank and prestige, and I will already tell you that before we jump into this, I think when you finish this video, you will say to yourself, yeah, these mechanics sound good. They're really good. I personally will say this is a fairly inoffensive Dev Diary in the sense that not much changed, but the changes that were made to the mechanics that we already had just make it so that the systems work better, at least on paper. How that actually plays out, of course, in the game, I don't know. Now, if you were to disagree, if you were to say, ProperVarian, you're a fool and an absolute buffoon, no, this is a terrible change, or this is a great change, then do let me know in the comments. I personally found them to be good, but nothing that blows me away or that gets me too upset to begin with. So let's just jump in and take a look at rank and prestige. Today we're finally switching away from talking about economy and politics and starting on a string of diplomacy-oriented Dev Diaries, of which the first one is this one, where we will be covering rank and prestige. Rank and prestige, of course, you know them from Victoria 2, from Victoria 1 if you played those, but certain things were tweaked, certain things were reiterated upon, and they came out significantly better. So let's jump into it to find out what actually changed. Rank is a mechanic that also existed in both previous Victoria games and is a measure of how glorious and influential a country is in the eyes of the rest of the world. What rank a country has, be it a mighty great power or a largely irrelevant unrecognized power, is determined by two factors: prestige, which we'll be explaining below, and recognition. Now when it comes to recognition, people that for example are in international law or international relationships, they may be thinking, aha, does that mean, whether Great Britain recognizes the government of Prussia? No, it does not. That is not really what it means, so let's just check what it does mean. Rather, it is a measure of whether the reigning, probably mostly European great powers as a whole see the country as a potential equal. For example, whether the country could potentially be included as a decision maker in said system if they grew strong enough. I think the best example, if we want to go about historical examples here, is effectively Japan. I believe Japan was basically in this unrecognized situation. They weren't really treated as equals. I mean, many other countries weren't really treated as equals, but Japan is a special case here in this sense, because in 1904, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was 1904, they won the war against Russia, and this was a huge explosion when it comes to diplomatic relationships and the diplomatic understanding of the world, because for the first time, at least on such a grand scale, for the first time a European power had been defeated, and Japan was being welcomed on basically the concert, well, of Europe isn't right, the concert of the world, to say, Japan, yes, you are one of the big guys, you're one of the big fellows that go around and beat the other weaker and poorer fellows up. So basically we're talking about a system that of course primarily recognizes you in the power structure that exists. If you had a mod that, I don't know, sets everything in East Asia, for example, Japan would already be a great power most likely, but on the other hand, of course, Prussia could, be an unrecognized power that wants to be colonized, or that is what the Japanese say anyway. So I hope you get where they are coming from here. That is also how it was, of course, in Victoria 2, but in Victoria 2 I think it was less explicit in the sense that you just were objectively good. I mean, we had the situation with recognized and unrecognized, which in Victoria 2 was, of course, westernized and not westernized countries, right? And that is not really an adequate measurement. When we go back to the Japan example right here, you will see that this doesn't really actually reflect the truth, because as Japan, you would be westernizing much before Japan, and that is both in the game but also historically, would be in a position of actually challenging a European power and becoming a recognized power, meaning until 1904, technically speaking, Japan can be counted as an unrecognized power. Maybe a bit earlier if they already start fighting back, that sort of stuff. I hope you get where I'm coming from there, but basically we are switching now towards a system that recognizes it significantly better when a country would actually be welcomed, or, well, forcibly welcomed to the table of the big players of whatever scenario you're playing. We're not going to go too deep into this specific topic today, as we'll return to it in a later Dev Diary, but the gist of it is that countries start the game either unrecognized or recognized, and unrecognized countries have to gain or force recognition in order to properly climb the rank ladder, much like I told you just with Japan. Even if you westernize as Japan, even if you, start building factories, even if you become a GDP powerhouse, if you have a gigantic army, if they don't think that you are one of them, if they don't think that you are worthy of sitting on the table, then they're not going to give you that seat on the table. So this westernization classification in Victoria 2 was really inadequate on many levels, of course, but gameplay-wise it just didn't reflect how, for example, Japan actually gained access to this table and how other countries persisted, or rather, made it out there, like, for example, Siam, like, for example, Ethiopia, and so on. We're not going to go too deep. Oh, I already read that. Here we go. Being an unrecognized country is purely a diplomatic status with diplomatic penalties. A country does not become inherently worse at constructing factories or fighting wars by virtue of being scorned by Metternich and his friends. Metternich, of course, the Austrian, I believe, foreign minister. He may actually have been the chancellor, I'm not certain. You know what? I'm not sure. Though many countries with unrecognized status do also start out on the lower end of the technological scale. If you played Victoria 2, then you will know playing a westernized country is very boring. You basically go out and conquer stuff because that gives you research points which you can then put into reforms, and those reforms then will, once you westernize, actually let you unlock the actual tech tree, meaning there's like 20, maybe 30 years, depending on how fast, depending on how slow you are, but those years are there, and you can't really do much about them because, those years say you can't research any tech. Now, that won't be the case anymore. A Japan in 1900 isn't significantly different from a Japan in 1904, except for the fact that in 1904 they were recognized because they defeated mighty Russia. So I think this is a really good step. That just makes it effectively so that you can play and have interesting, immersive, and realistic gameplay without having to say, I gotta sit here for basically 20 years, conquer some stuff, do some reforms, and then I can actually start with a tech tree and am immediately recognized. This sort of recognition isn't actually something that happens internally. It is something that happens on the international external scale, and I think that is exactly well represented here with unrecognized and recognized. Again, this is the new step from westernized and unwesternized, and it is so much better in, again, many, many ways, but specifically when you look at the gameplay angle, I think it is much more appropriate, it is much more realistic, and I think it should make for way better gameplay than what we had in, for example, Japan or any other unwesternized nation in Victoria 2. Right here we have the rank of the Great Qing. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Great Qing, of course, is the heaven-sent, heaven-blessed dynasty of China. And as you can see, they are unrecognized, meaning that nobody actually says, yep, you are one of the big players. They are at the rank 80, and if I see this correctly here, this basically means this is as high as they can go, because the Great Qing, despite not being recognized, is, of course, incredibly impressive in its might, with how many people they command over, and with how many opportunities they technically could have. Now, this is interesting. We have 1,122 prestige. That is a lot of prestige. You're going to see that later as well. If the prestige of the Great Qing is reduced below 55 for an extended time, their rank will decrease to unrecognized minor power. So, you can see the Great Qing is hugely above an unrecognized minor power, and yet they are an unrecognized power. They have no way of going higher because the Great Qing cannot achieve a higher rank than unrecognized power due to their unrecognized country status, limiting them to a maximum position of 80 in the world. They are the top dogs, but the top dogs don't listen to them at all, basically. And that is a pretty interesting system. That doesn't mean that Great Qing couldn't go out and industrialize like crazy, become an absolute massive powerhouse. But maybe nobody would take them seriously unless they beat, let's say, Great Britain, maybe, Russia, and so on, in a war. If they do that, then they have to be recognized. Maybe they can just gain it. I don't know what the other tools would be to gain it, but again, this would be the historical Japan example. All in all, there are 6 different ranks that a country can occupy in Victoria 3, as well as a special 7th rank that only applies to decentralized and non-playable nations, so primarily minors, for example, in, I believe, New Zealand and Africa, for example. And they often have a global, I keep misreading here, and so isn't of any real interest to talk about today, so we're not going to hear about decentralized. Please note that the names of some of these may be subject to change. Great powers, these are the most powerful and glorious of nations and often have a global reach, getting involved in far-off conflicts. For example, Great Britain, Prussia, France, and so on. Major power, these are regional powerhouses that often decide the course of conflicts in their home regions and may have limited global presence. An example would be, for example, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Of course, very influential in that region, but beyond that, not really. Minor powers, these are regional powers that may be important for determining how a local conflict in their home region turns out, but are generally irrelevant in the world stage. This is, for example, Mexico. Mexico, of course, under the burden, they have the UCFR, is that it? The United Central American Republic? UCAR? That stuff, until it dissolves, of course, very early on into the game, but Mexico is sort of trumped, of course, once the US come in, once they take that land, and then Mexico is indeed reduced to a minor power, but it doesn't have to go that way. And then there are also insignificant powers. These are nations that generally do not even have the ability to influence the outcome of local conflicts, and can be safely ignored by anyone other than other insignificant powers in their immediate vicinity. For example, the Free City of Krakow, probably Luxembourg as well, once they become independent. Currently, of course, they are under administration by the Dutch. I believe that is where the Dutch royal family actually comes from. Could be wrong there as well, though. And I assume many of the other city-states, stuff like Frankfurt and so on and so forth in Germany would also be counted as an insignificant power, because that is what they were. They didn't really have any influence to look forward to, and I would assume that being an insignificant power is also basically where you start out. Yeah, you are recognized, you are a government, the other agree that you have a right to rule over your state, but at the same time, they are not going to take you seriously. That should be one of the hardest playthroughs, I think. I'm very, very eager to play Krakow. It's a beautiful playthrough in both Victoria 1 and Victoria 2 if you really min-max it, because you have to get the right allies and the right payouts, the right crises in Victoria 2, for example, that sort of stuff. Then you have unrecognized power. That's, for example, the Qing, the Great Qing. These are unrecognized powers that are powerful and prestigious enough to throw their weight on a regional stage, try to resist the demands of the recognized powers, and to be a potential candidate for recognition. For example, again, the Qing Empire, and long-term, of course, also Japan. Then the unrecognized minor power. These are unrecognized powers that generally lack the power to go up against anyone other than the weakest of recognized powers, and will often find themselves at the mercy of great and major powers and having to play them against each other to survive. Sounds very exciting, sounds also almost impossible. This is, for example, the Kingdom of Nepal. Now, how do ranks actually work, though? Generally, the higher a country's rank, the more influence capacity it generates, allowing for greater freedom in conducting diplomacy and signing diplomatic pacts. Very interesting, so it is very, very important for you that you are in a fairly high rank if you want to keep your global empire that, you know, is built on puppets, that is built on coalitions, if you want that to persist. The more declared interests it can support, more on that next week. Declared interests, I have to assume, means something like, I declare that West Africa is French. And if you come here, I will go against you. I think that is maybe what it means. Maybe it also means, hey, I want to protect this nation, or you better get out of, for example, the free city of Krakow, because I have this as one of those playing fields that I want to have under my control, rather than you have it under your control. What that exactly is, we're going to learn next week. And then there are also maneuvers that... and the more maneuvers it has in diplomatic plays, more on that in a few weeks. If I had to guess, and this is a wild guess because we don't actually know, I would guess that maneuvers are something like, hey, I want this and they want that, and let's do a bit of negotiating, you know, maybe something like that. I'm very excited to find out about that in a few weeks. Rank also plays a key role in many other systems, such as subjects, infamy, diplomatic actions, and more, some of which we'll get into in the coming weeks. I know I keep saying that, but bear with me, we've only just started on diplomacy. There's a lot to talk about, I assume. France starts the game as the second great power, just behind Britain in prestige. Look at him, this is... this is a Bourbon, right? They started in 1815, the Bourbons went back on the throne. Don't know his name, I have to assume it's a Louis. They're always Louis, you know how it is, right? Louis the 17th, 18th. Napoleon, so the Napoleon dynasty with Napoleon III, he would then lose the battle against, in Verdun, against the Germans, against the... Well, I mean, it was Germans at that point, I suppose. He is, of course, in a position where, you know, I mean, first of all, he looks pretty dapper, he looks pretty good. I really like how the models are coming along. And he is currently the ruler, he's number 2, he is, of course, France, Her Majesty's government, the landowners are in control. What else do we have? 260 points in military, 105 points in navy, then the GDP is 38.1 million, got a good population, pretty okay literacy, I guess. Standard of living seems to be not that great, state religion Catholic, and primary cultures are only French right now, the arable land 1113. So you can see they have current prestige that is less than what the Great Qing have. Again, look at this. That is crazy, isn't it? That is less than the Great Qing have. But they are in a position where they can do things because they are recognized by others and are in a position to actually push their claim to glory. If the prestige of France is reduced below 219 for an extended time, their rank will decrease to major power. How exactly that works, we're going to see in a second, but that is still a major difference here. From 730, you need to go down all the way to 219, meaning you need to lose all of this, and then you're still at like, what, 300 and something? Probably. Honestly, didn't do the math there. I think 300 and something. And then we're looking at a situation, maybe 400, honestly, forget about it. And then we're still looking at something where the GDP pushes you up so high that you still won't even be just a major power, still a great power. Prestige, as was mentioned above, plays a central role in all of this. Simply put, prestige is what determines who gets to occupy what rank in the global pecking order. Unlike in Victoria 1 and 2, where prestige was just one of 3 factors determining what rank a country had. So, prestige, then the military, which was navy and military, and then GDP. That was how you did it in Victoria 2. And this is, of course, an object that I have criticized a lot, and I think that most people criticize a lot, because the way it worked in Victoria 2, prestige, as one of those 3 things, could be leveraged to an insane degree. It was called, or is called, prestige spam, where you basically have nothing. You don't have a navy, you don't have a military, you don't have factories. But you were the one to first research romanticism and then get the innovation or the invention that comes from it, and that invention, since you were the first one to discover it, gives you a lot of prestige. Is it a good thing that that is no longer the case? Yes, it is. Believe me. Because back in the day, you could basically cheese anything. You could become a great power without any needs. I played Victoria 1 just recently, and I mentioned it very tangentially, but I was Germany, and for some reason, don't worry about it too much, but the North German and the South German federations were my puppets, and they both only had one province. But both of them did prestige spam, and constantly. I was rank 1, of course. I was the great power that was on top. But they were, I think, 5 and 8. Constantly, because they would just research the stuff that really aided them in getting the prestige up. That sucks. Really happy that is gone. What exactly prestige is in Victoria 3, we're gonna see right here. Victoria 3 is the accumulation of all factors that makes a country more or less glorious. In order to become a certain rank, a country must meet the prestige threshold for that rank, which is based on both how it compares to the global average and percentile-wise compared to the most prestigious country. This is also really good. In Victoria 2, I mean in Victoria 1 as well, you were looking at a thing where there were only ever 8 great powers, which is of course kind of nonsense, because we are talking about a multipolar world where basically many people could have a shot, where many people could come in and demand that something happen and that something would change. And that number wasn't really something. It was, you know, hey, if you split all of the great powers, you would end up with 16 great powers, because they would still be incredibly influential. But that didn't happen in Victoria 2. They would just be 8 great powers, and 8 would basically be shafted. Now that would no longer be the case, because the way it works now is you can become a great power if you are a recognized country, must not be a subject of any other nation, that makes sense, and must have at least 3 times the average global prestige, meaning if the average global prestige is 230 then or 200, then you need 600. Or at least 75% of the prestige of the most prestigious nation. This means if the global average, and that times 3 is 600, you would only need, I think, like, let's say the actual top dog has 500, so it is not even in this triple, in this tripling in there. You would only have to have, what, like 450, something like that, and you would be in. So these are 2 options that you have. It very much depends on how much the top dog is running away with the score, you know, how much they are running it up on the scoring board. But I have to say, I think this system is significantly better. Not only is it more flexible by giving more spots to great powers that genuinely deserve it, but you're now actually looking at a situation where you don't need to be afraid that, you know, you as the Ottomans are gonna, or you as Spain, for example, are gonna drop off the actual great power score, and you need to get some prestige spam going, because you don't drop off unless you actually drop off comparatively to the leader. So that is quite nice. The number of great powers, major powers, and so on is not fixed to a specific number, as it was in Victoria 1 and 2, where you would always have 8 of each, and that the requirements to maintain and increase your rank will change over the course of the game. A country might start as a great power due to their starting prestige, but then begin quickly falling behind due to an economic and military stagnation, eventually being reduced to a major power, even though their actual prestige number never went down. Makes sense, right? That makes perfect sense. Persia is able to occupy a rank position above what its economy and army can support through considerable investments into the arts. Let's take a look at this. And now that I look at it, actually, I am no longer sure. Actually, no, I'm actually no longer sure. These are not the... I thought these were the raw numbers for just what, you know, goes into your prestige, but I don't think they are. Because actually looking at this, maybe they're just actually 2 ships and then 45 brigades. Persia is an unrecognized power. We are 87th in the world. We have 127 prestige. If we fall below 59, then we just become a minor unrecognized power. And as you can see, let me zoom in a bit here. As you can see right here, our prestige is 127. Where does it come from? First of all, our country tier is kingdom, right? That gives us a plus 50, quite interesting. I think we're going to see something for that a bit lower. Then our GDP is 16, our army projection power is 18, and if you look at this, if let's say these are 45 brigades, we're talking about... So it looks like the army power projection is roughly 1/3 of your brigades. It's probably not actually purely this. They did mention earlier, I think that they said it actually, oh, they're going to say it afterwards. They're going to say that it is both based on how big your army is, but also on how good and imposing they're looking. So there is probably a lot more math than just, yeah, 45 divided by whatever is 18, right? And then we have the navy power projection, that is +3, but you can already see 2 and +3, so navy power projection definitely is larger by default than the army power projection, because of course, maintaining a navy is significantly more expensive than maintaining an army. Now, then you also have +20 from arts academies in Laristan and Sistan. Very, very interesting. That is interesting because, again, the prestige spam in Victoria 2, it basically worked via, you sit down, you invent something, and then you say, hey, nice, the RNG favored me. No longer the case. Now you actually need to have a building. You need to be able to maintain that building by putting people into these art academies. Very nice. I personally like it a lot. +10% from ruler trade, Imperius. I don't actually know... who this ruler would be. But look, let's take a look at them. They are Persian and Azerbaijani. Their standard of living is lower than France's, not surprising, of course, France. The literacy is less than half of what France has, and their GDP is literally nothing. Look at this in comparison to France right there. And yet, because they have the arts academies, and because they are a kingdom, they are in a position where they can say, boom, we can smack you because we have pretty good prestige nonetheless. Now, they are unrecognized, but hey, that is just how life is sometimes. Now, what is prestige actually made of? This is, oh, see, I overlooked this one, and now I'm very happy that I saw it again. The tier of a country plays a big role here, whether it is considered a city-state, principality, kingdom, or so on, so empire and so on and so forth. I would assume, for example, that if, you know, our queen goes on and says, I am now the Empress of India, that gives a bit of a buff, a bit of an upgrade, makes them even stronger because the tier of their country would be rising up. This is inherent to a specific nation and can only be increased by forming a new, more glorious nation. So basically, formables, I would guess, confirmed, right? I would also guess that maybe you can just declare it if you are Spain, for example. Why wouldn't you be able to declare yourself emperor if you rule over multiple, you know, maybe about 2 Sicilies on top of that, maybe about Portugal as well. If you rule over all of those folks, maybe you can become an empire, despite, of course, they're not historically being an empire, except for the one time that they actually were Holy Roman emperors as well. Right. Having a large army gives prestige, with more prestige being given based on its ability to both fight effectively and look imposing. I would assume they don't really look imposing, so army power projection is significantly lower than the military that is listed right there. The total GDP makes sense, I don't think we need to debate that. Subjects contribute prestige to their suzerain based on their military and economic might. Very cool, very, very good. Obviously, a given, but just seeing that confirmed here is very, very nice because it makes it so that you don't need to color everything in you know, in your actual color. No, you can just say, I'm going to give this to one of my vassals, and then we're going to move on from there. Being a global leader, first, second, or third, in the production of a good gives a country prestige, with some goods being more prestigious than others. Very cool as well. Again, this is a big focus on the GDP aspect here. If you basically outcompete everybody else, you're in a position where you can say, I dominate, and that should bring you recognition right there. Building and supporting art academies is also a factor that goes into it, as we saw earlier. Being a sponsor of the arts, that gives prestige, of course, and successful undertaking of certain globally recognized projects, such as undertaking major expeditions to certain regions, finding, for example, the origin of the Nile and such, or the construction of a canal, given a country a permanent increase in its prestige. Really, really nice. Listen, at the end of the day, no matter how we look at it, the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, they were prestige projects. Yes, they had huge positive impacts, of course, as well on a GDP level, but they were projects of prestige. Those production sites were ludicrous. They were insane. Because, you know, hey, try to build actually one of those things with the tech from back then, and you will see how it goes. And that is exactly basically what's going on right here. They're basically saying only a power that is worthy of recognition and worthy of prestige could be doing this. Now, this is all for today. We're going to be moving on next week to diplomacy-related mechanics, namely relations, infamy, and interests. Really, really interested in all of this. But I will say, just to sum it up again, I think the new calculation of prestige, it seems to take away the prestige spam as we know it from Victoria 1 and 2. It seems to put you into a position where it's really evaluating where you are in the real world in comparison to everybody else. And that is also something that we can see in the actual mechanics related to ranks, because they are more dynamic, and they are in a position, of course, where we can sit down and say, hey folks, you know what? We know that, you know, maybe the multipolar world is truly multipolar, so let's not limit it to 8, but if you are in a position of defeating Russia, you will become recognized and can then actually, you know, swing around your entire prestige instead of just saying, yeah, I'm very prestigious, I'm very built up, I'm very smart, we do all these things, but they don't think I'm a real nation. Boom. Beat them up, get them out of there, and then you're good to go. I think this system is significantly better than what we had in Victoria 2. May I just remind you of the uncivilized and civilized step in Victoria 2, where basically as Japan you would be westernized, you would be civilized very, very early on, but that's not actually what this sort of recognition thing meant. But once you westernize, once you become civilized, you know, in Victoria 2 terms again, once you do that in Victoria 2, you can immediately become a great power, and that's really not how that worked. It's a big boys club, and they don't want you in it, because they don't want competition, meaning that you need to fight for it, maybe you need some allies, that sort of stuff. I'm a big fan of the rework here. I think this is a really good reiteration of the old system that we had in Victoria 2, of course, and this is significantly superior, but it's also kind of logical. I'll be honest with you, like, this didn't really throw me off the, you know, this wasn't a curveball, because I was expecting this to do something roughly like this. I wanted to see something that says, okay, we learned from the errors that were present in Victoria 1 and 2, and I think they did. And I think they fixed it in a pretty good manner. So, let me know what you think in the comments, but with this being said, I'm out, and I will see you later, alligator.